Hello and welcome to yet another video about the integrated rail plan. Yes, I know I have about 30 videos from over the summer which I haven't yet edited. I also have about 26 summative essays to write, but nevertheless I am bringing you yet another video about the government's integrated rail plan, specifically on its impacts and implications for one region, West Yorkshire. West Yorkshire is probably the region that has lost the most from the integrated rail plan, that is hit hardest. The headlines being, of course, the cutting back of High Speed 2's eastern leg to only go as far as East Midlands Parkway, nowhere near West Yorkshire. So West Yorkshire loses out on its connectivity towards Sheffield and the East Midlands and Birmingham. And, of course, the shortening of Northern Powerhouse Rail, a small bit of new line will be built between Manchester and Marsden on the border of West Yorkshire. The integrated rail plan also includes £100 million towards starting to develop mass transit in West Yorkshire. Leeds, West Yorkshire, is one of the largest cities, regions in Europe without any form of mass transit whatsoever, not a tram, not an underground metro, not nothing. And so this is going to start to address that. And there's also £100 million being put towards, quote unquote, bringing HS2 trains to Leeds, whatever that means, without actually building HS2. By the way, the copying of the report itself is terrible because these two figures are repeatedly confused and combined in contradictory ways, but I won't dwell on that too much. As far as I understand, there's £100 million being put towards West Yorkshire mass transit and £100 million towards some sort of study on filling that gap in the integrated rail plan, a gap which the plan has created between Sheffield and Leeds. So beyond those headlines, let's take a deeper look at what the integrated rail plan means for West Yorkshire. Well, truth be told, I am neither an expert on West Yorkshire nor railways, or at least not railway engineering, so I thought I'd talk to some people who really do know what they're talking about. I'm very excited to be joined by Alex Sobel, MP for Leeds North West, and rail engineer and writer Gareth Dennis. Thank you both very much for coming on. If I could start with you, Alex, as an MP representing part of West Yorkshire, what does the integrated rail plan mean for your constituents and constituents of your region?
Well, it's a terrible disappointment from what we were originally promised by the Prime Minister. So the big issue is particularly east-west connectivity, so from Hull to Liverpool. And what we were expecting was that between Leeds and Manchester, there would be a brand new rail line that would pass through Bradford, which is the worst connected city of over 500,000 people in the country. And that they also have two train stations, and it would unite, and there would be one single train station which people could use to come to Leeds and then on to Hull or to Manchester and on to Liverpool and other places around the country. But instead of that, what the government did was say that they'd just upgrade the line, the existing line from Huddersfield to Leeds, which completely misses out Bradford and doesn't give us the capacity increase we need. So it's, part of it is about speed, about getting people to places quicker, but a bigger part is capacity. At peak times, those Transpennine trains are absolutely rammed. And so we need this additional line to be able to move people.
And what would the Labour Party do? Let's say Prime Minister Keir Starmer, Transport Secretary Louise Haigh. What would you be doing if you were in power?
I think we would fulfil the promise, which is MPR, and not this half-baked scheme. I mean, this scheme doesn't actually preclude us building, and Gareth's probably more expert than me, but doesn't preclude us building the MPR line from Leeds to Manchester, because they are effectively in that section just upgrading the existing line and putting new trains on. So, even if that work starts, we could still build MPR through Bradford in the same way with the new station. The other thing, I might want to say is that in the Conservative Party manifesto, they promised mass transit system for Leeds and West Yorkshire. Leeds is the largest city in the whole of Europe without mass transit, has no tram, has no underground, has no real suburban rail in the sense that mass transit is. It would cost, the first phase, which West Yorkshire Combined Authority and the Mayor Tracy Braben have developed, would cost about £3 billion to build. The government announced £200 million of feasibility money, but hidden in there was 100 million of that had to be used to work out how to get HS2 trains, but not the track, from Sheffield to Leeds, which has nothing to do with mass transit in Leeds. So, effectively they gave us £100 million, which is chicken feed, to develop the mass transit in Leeds. So another thing, that Labour would commit to is getting that mass transit system built.
You've preempted some of my follow-up questions there, but that's absolutely fine. Gareth, if I could ask you, Bradford obviously is getting left a bit out in the dark by Northern Powerhouse Rail being cancelled, but the government would have us believe that Dewsbury and Huddersfield, both West Yorkshire towns, by continuing to be on the main line, by continuing to be served by trains on the main route between Manchester and Leeds, actually benefit from these plans. According to what the government say, under the previous plans, the service to Dewsbury and Huddersfield would have gotten worse. What do you make of that?
That's nonsense. It's total rot. So the challenge we have is that the author singular of the IRP, which is Andrew Gilligan, doesn't understand railways, fundamentally does not understand the way that railways work. As a result of that, you get situations where these statements about, oh no, they're getting a fantastic, they'll still be on the main line, so they get a vast, their service will be great. These statements can be enabled by the fact that there is a fixation on journey times alone, and in the purest sense, because actually what should be happening is that the existing line that runs through Huddersfield, the Huddersfield line that's kind of currently the main line between Leeds and Manchester, should become, and this is where Labour's sort of desire to not use the NPR name and use Crossrail of the North is kind of right it's kind of the wrong name, but actually it's right, because what NPR enables is a Crossrail of the North on the Huddersfield line. So the Huddersfield line would become a suburban railway system, a proper high density suburban railway system, which means that you'd have trains, whereas at the moment you get maybe 4 or at best 6 trains an hour along that line, you'd potentially double the number of trains that run an hour on that service by getting rid of the non-stop services, by improving the way, by essentially creating a railway conveyor belt of trains that all do the same thing and therefore can get nose to tail much more. And so what that would mean is, rather than turning up at Huddersfield and having to know which train you need to get to make your connection, you don't care. You arrive at Huddersfield station, you hop on the next train that's going in the direction you want to go, and then you make your way to the next major in-city station, which would be Leeds or could be Manchester. That journey would be quite quick. The advantage of electrifying the whole route is that actually the hit that you get from the trains stopping more frequently at all the intermediate services would be made up for by the fact they're electric, and therefore they can climb the hill much more easily. They're lighter trains, they accelerate more quickly. So, so it's just not true that Huddersfield and Dewsbury will have an improvement. And frankly, particularly for Dewsbury will lose service as a result of these proposals. It will lose the service it currently has now. It'll have a reduction in service in order to enable these fast trains. You cannot run the whole point of High Speed 2, the whole point of NPR, the whole point of, the new fast line of the Pennines was to segregate high-speed services so that the high-speed line can take the long-distance services, and the existing railway network can become a suburban railway network, so you get high-density services and also solve some of the freight problems we have as well.
So my next question was going to be returning to the point of West Yorkshire mass transit, because it's not entirely fair to say integrated rail plan has nothing for West Yorkshire, because it does earmark £100 million for starting development on West Yorkshire mass transit. Alex just referred to that as chicken feeds. Do you agree with him there?
Well, £100 million, that'll be to pay people like me, design consultants, to work out what that that network should look like. But Leeds has done that several times. People are quite aware that I'm very much left of centre, but it is successive governments of all colours that have failed to deliver mass transit for Leeds. I think Alex will admit that. I think he'll be free to admit that. But Leeds needs mass transit, and the IRP is just like it is for other things, like a station at Towton down in the East Midlands, just like it is for several other things. It says, oh, well, yeah, that'll happen probably, won't it? There's absolutely nothing set in stone about mass transit. That was merely a fop to satisfy the fact that they knew that they had some level of foresight that cancelling HS2 and cancelling NPR on the kind of the east side of the Pennines will have a massive hit. It's not just NPR. I know Alex and a lot of people focus a lot on the connections across to Bradford, and rightly so, because they're very important. But the lack of HS2 connection into Leeds is also equally massive. The suburban connectivity to the south and the southeast of Leeds is hopeless. Connections down to Doncaster towards Sheffield. These are incredibly congested routes. Alex will know this himself. As someone who lives up there, you will use these routes. They're incredibly congested. HS2 arriving in Leeds freed up a huge amount of capacity in the existing network to improve suburban connections down in the southeastern direction, as well as the benefits you get towards the west and the northwest.
Alex, did you want to come in? Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think the thing I talk about is issues we have in Leeds and Bradford, going down to Dewsbury and Wakefield and the Five Towns in terms of getting modal shift. So getting people out of their cars and getting them onto public transport, because at the moment the connections are too slow. There's too much traffic on the road for the buses to be a good option, even with some bus lanes and some segregation. And so a tram, which mainly runs on segregated lines, is the only thing that's going to get people out of their cars and onto alternatives. And if you think about sort of longer commutes, so the first phase of tram scheme is going to start in Dewsbury, come to Leeds, and then go down to the Five Towns in Wakefield and through Bradford. And it's going to service that area. Now, at the moment, although you can go from the centre of Dewsbury, centre of Leeds on the train, you go from some parts of the Five Towns to centre of Leeds on the train. You can't go to Bradford, and the connectivity around the individual places is poor. So it's going to get those people in those places making journeys which aren't sort of point to point from the centre of Dewsbury to the centre of Leeds, or from centre of Pontefract to the centre of Leeds, out of their cars and onto the tram. And so it's going to have a huge impact, one, on the roads, and two, it's going to have a climate impact and an air quality impact, because the tram's obviously not going to run on diesel, unlike, for instance, my local suburban rail train, which is the Harrogate line, which hasn't been electrified, although the government have promised twice to electrify it and then reneged on that promise. Just something else that's worth mentioning, and there's no money for that in the IRP either. And other diesel rail lines that are not being promised to be electrified. But so it is absolutely vitally important in terms of the issues of congestion, air quality, and climate. Yeah. For Leeds, Bradford, Dewsbury, and the Five Towns. Yeah, absolutely.
The thing that I think is frustrating is that the IRP, which is ostensibly was supposed to be a report about the integration of HS2 and HS3, or the Trans-Pennine High Speed Line, or NPR, whatever you want to call it, was ostensibly supposed to be about the integration of those into the existing network. By tying West Yorkshire Mass Transit into that ostensibly heavy rail report, they've almost made it like, oh, unless you're happy with the IRP, you ain't getting your West Yorkshire Mass Transit. That's, for me, is the thing that makes me most angry about the way the government has put the IRP forwards, as if the IRP is somehow delivering West Yorkshire Mass Transit, which is obviously West Yorkshire Mass Transit should be happening now. It should be getting funded. There don't need to be another 2 or 3 or 10 years of consultation. Leeds has needed this for 20 years, and I don't think it will reflect well on this government, frankly, when it comes to the ballot box. People of the North are not naive, and they don't like being taken for fools.
I mean, there's a very clear commitment in the Conservative Party manifesto to West Yorkshire Mass Transit. It's not, you know, we're gonna implement West Yorkshire Mass Transit dependent on something else. It just says they're going to deliver it. And when you put a clear manifesto commitment, you need to deliver it. And I'm afraid, you know, there are a lot of quite new Conservative members of Parliament in West Yorkshire, and I've not heard them jumping up and down shouting, "Where's my mass transit?"
Can I just briefly return to the point of the £100 million being allocated to developing further options to bring HS2 trains to Leeds? Gareth, can you shed a bit of light onto what that means? Because it's an incredibly vague statement. I mean, what do you
It means this government has no interest in extending high speed 2 through these Midlands, through into Yorkshire and beyond. That's what it means. It's like, why are you spending 100 million on it? You just spent several £billions of design fee on working out how to get HS2 trains into Leeds. It's called HS2. If the designs were finished, or the designs were reaching the point where they were moving into detailed design stage. It's done. Why have you reneged on it? You know, this is why everything costs so much in construction in our country, because government has the industry has absolutely no confidence. The contractors have no confidence to employ the right staff to deliver this work. There's no pipeline long term. You know, we have no idea what skills we need long term to actually kind of build these mass transit or sort of heavy rail systems, because government just decides on a whim to change its mind again. It always comes back to the fact that Treasury are a serious problem here, but it goes beyond that. This goes beyond the endemic problems we have with a Treasury uninterested in investing for Britain's future. This has moved into being a very much become an ideological stance of this government, that they are uninterested in and wish to defund heavy rail across this country. That's what's happening. That's why we're seeing 8,000 redundancies at Network Rail, right at the point where we need rail to be doubling its capacity by the middle of the century. It's why we're seeing pressure being put on train operating companies to reduce headcount. That's why we're seeing services being cut. You know, this government's talking about beach. I don't want to make this a party political thing, but unfortunately, government is in power, and so it does become that way. The government talks about reversing beaching and all its wonderful nonsense that it comes out with in that front. But let's just be clear that this government is presiding over the biggest cuts to local rail services since the 1960s. Happening right now across the country. And the IRP will actually embed that. The IRP will mean that local services will be cut, and it actually potentially means that local stations will close. That's the level of impact that it has. So £100 million to work out, essentially that's £100 million to work out which local stations are going to be closed to enable fast trains to run into Leeds. That's not a good way to spend £100 million in my eyes.
For my final question for both of you, looking beyond HS2 East and Northern Powerhouse Rail, let's say they both get built. You've both talked at length a bit about West Yorkshire mass transit. What else would you say that West Yorkshire needs looking into the future? What else does it need for its transport? Gareth, if I could start with you.
Yeah, sure. For me, West Yorkshire mass transit is critical. I've already analysed the most detailed reports on that so far, and it's a very impressive manifesto for what needs to happen across. But on top of that, and the West Yorkshire Mass Transit report acknowledges this, there also need to be heavy rail upgrades. So creating what essentially acts as a Thameslink or a Crossrail style S train, suburban train, heavy, high density rail service across the Pennines, particularly on the Huddersfield line, but also connecting through on some of the lines that are less heavily, through Harrogate actually needs to be an increase in density there. That's a very busy commuting line that has a very rural railway service. There are major opportunities, connections down to Doncaster towards South Yorkshire as well. There are huge opportunities to increase the heavy rail capacity as well. And it entirely complements. So exactly as Alex was pointing out, West Yorkshire Mass Transit is what it provides a feeder kind of into the urban areas from the fringes. That's critical. But then you provide some of that heavy rail capacity that is actually, for example, in Manchester, where they rely heavily on Metrolink for that. That's a challenge for them. They have a challenge in capacity on mass transit because the Metrolink is so successful. They're actually struggling to get enough capacity into a light rail system. So you need both. The mass transit is critical for bypassing buses, for providing an option, a viable, an appealing option instead of cars. But you need to have both. You need to have that alongside rail improvements. And what high speed segregation achieves is freeing up the existing network to allow more movement of high density rail services, but also for freight as well, critically.
Alex, if you want the last word on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some other things which don't involve building rail, even light rail, and that for instance, integrated ticketing between transport modes, between public sector transport modes, even bikes. What I'd like to see is mayors like Tracy Brabin and Andy Burnham getting TfL style powers and for bus franchising and control of rail services as well, suburban rail services, and that would mean that we could have that, and that would reduce the cost of travel. It would get modal shift. It would sort of, the technology is moving that way, but the powers aren't moving that way quickly enough. But on the other side, I think we need full electrification. This country's way behind the rest of Europe on electrification lines. We need to see the end of diesel trains. The government are sort of backwards and forwards on this all the time. Technology, talking about hydrogen and hybrid, and but it's moving very slowly. And like Gareth says, the industry hasn't got any confidence because they keep changing their minds. And the other thing is that we do need some restoration of some of the former beaching cuts, particularly around freight. So a really important one, which I was expecting in the IRP and wasn't, was the Cone to Skipton line, which actually is really important for freight, but also for people in particularly in East Lancs to be able to access employment in places like Manchester and Leeds and Bradford. And so there's just a huge amount to do. And the RP has sort of effectively neglected, huge areas of absolutely vital work, which actually we thought, we were shocked because it's not what we were expecting. We were expecting some level of pullback, particularly on HS2, but not the level that there was in the IRP.
Any final thoughts, either of you?
Just to echo everything Alex has said, yeah, there's so many soft things that can be done. I obviously talk about hard kind of physical infrastructure because those things take longer and require more of a long-term commitment. But no, absolutely echo what Alex says, particularly on ticketing. It's such an easy win. Just do what TfL have done. Just do that. It's not rocket science. Just do that. You know, the trouble is it involves a relinquishment of power from Westminster, and this government are anti-devolution. They're anti-devolution in London. You look at what's happening to TfL. The TfL, the way that this government is interacting with TfL is a canary in the coal mine for what they don't want to happen elsewhere. So, you know, this isn't London versus the North. Actually, you can see London are having power stripped from them. So it's just bad news all around for devolution and for people being well represented by those who are in power.
Yeah, it's a power grab for people who are unable to wield power, which is the worst sort of power grab. I mean, where people are unable to deliver, then, you know, there's some there is some logic. But TfL have shown themselves consistently over the last 20 years to be able to deliver, you know, good integrated mass transit. And and devolved authorities in the north of England should be given the same chance.
Alex Sobel and Gareth Dennis, thank you both very much for joining me. So there you have it. As you can see, the integrated rail plan has come under quite a lot of criticism from opposition nationally, the Labour Party nationally, but also locally in regions like West Yorkshire and also Greater Manchester, which is perhaps the topic of its own future Spotlight video. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching, and please subscribe and feel free to start your own flame war arguments about HS2, Northern Powerhouse Rail, the integrated rail plan, and all of that in the comments, as I'm sure you will.